Good evening and thank you for joining us on The Last Word tonight. My name is Sophia Wanuna. Delighted that you could make time for us this evening. Now, it's about 15 months to go to next year's general election, and the main opposition here in Kenya, the Coalition for Reforms and Democracy, has made it clear that Kenya should not go to next year's elections with the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission as is currently constituted. Tonight on the show, we focus on matters electoral management and as well as conduct of elections in the country. What to hear from you this evening? There's a hashtag that we're running on Twitter, The Last Word, and the question we posed is whether you think elections in Kenya are overly politicized. Share your thoughts with us. I see a couple of you already sending in your messages. We'll also be putting our phone numbers on your screen so that you can feel free to call in and be part of the conversation. We'd definitely love to hear from you tonight. Let me introduce my guest to you. Joining me on my immediate left is the Ombudsman. He's the chair of the Commission of Administrative Justice, Dr. Tiende Amolo, I beg your pardon.
Thank you.
And senior lecturer at the University of Nairobi, Dr. Collins Odote. Thank you both for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
I'll begin with you, sir, before we go to some of what we've had the politicians saying as far as elections are concerned and management, most importantly, because we have the IEBC in place now. But you wrote an advisory as the Ombudsman in as far as the commissioners and their tenure is concerned, talking about smooth transition and the importance for them to leave before then there's a crisis, constitutional crisis, you described it. So let me first get it clear. You do not have an issue in as far as what we've had the politicians raise on IEBC. It's simply a transitional time limit issue and concern you have, right?
Thank you, Sophia. Yes, indeed, on 5th of January this year, we did an advisory that touched on a number of issues, what we called transition in state offices, and it focused on the IEBC and the judiciary. But to put everything in context, I think insofar as IEBC is concerned, so far there are three issues. The first issue is one of legality. The second one, which many people apparently have raised, is one of legitimacy. And the third one, which for us is what we raised then, was one of necessity. And what we pointed out was that given the date that the commissioners were sworn in, they were gazetted on 9th of November, they were sworn in on 14th of November. And because the strict timeline is 6 years, our analysis, and we demonstrated it at length, suggests to us that if we hold elections in 8th August, as the IEBC itself has already said, and I agree with the analysis on that, then the contestations around elections could possibly outlive the tenure of the commissioners. And if that happens, we would have a crisis, because the courts have said quite recently, and it has always been our view, that you cannot have a commission without commissioners. So if then their tenure comes to an end, at a time that the electioneering process is not completely over, then it could be a crisis. And it was my view that perhaps out of necessity, the commissioners themselves should initiate the process of leaving and therefore forcing the politicians to think through how to reconstitute the commission.
All right, because I spoke to the IEBC chairman a while back, and he thought and felt that it was a bit of a stretch, the picture that was painted by the Commission of Administrative Justice. And as far as, you know, it saw an eventuality where there was a runoff and another runoff, which you said was highly unlikely. Do you agree with the thinking of the Ombudsman?
I think in terms of calculating time, there is a possibility that what the Ombudsman says can happen. There's that possibility.
It's possible.
So it's possible. So in terms of managing possibilities, I think there's a possibility. The place where I don't agree with my good friend the Ombudsman is in terms of how do we deal with that eventuality. Their suggestion is that out of necessity, the commissioners should contemplate resigning. I think to solve a possible constitutional problem based on goodwill and based on the benevolence of the people we are discussing, I think is sometimes leaving a possible problem to the wrong entity to solve. That's why I disagree with him.
All right, yeah, so because you're calling for the goodwill of the commissioners, you're telling them, hey, you could cause us a constitutional crisis, now leave office before that happens. Yet, you know, in terms of laws, people would hope that is envisioned and it's something that can be worked out there. So why seek and call upon their goodwill to come in place at this point?
Where we are, and I'd said there are three issues. There's the legality, legitimacy, and then necessity. Where we are in terms of legality if you must remove commissioners of IEBC or any other commission, you must follow Article 250. There must be an issue of misconduct or incompetence or bankruptcy or not following the Constitution. Now, that first of all, you'll remember that last year there was such a process which did not succeed in the National Assembly. I do not so far hear anything on which it can be grounded and which would make it succeed. The questions of legitimacy which have been raised, unfortunately, must come to that. Whether you have trust in IEBC or any other commission, if you want to remove the commissioners, you must come back to the grounds of removal. Now, the grounds that were put in the Constitution contemplate removal of a commissioner. It keeps thinking that perhaps one or two commissioners may need to be removed.
Which is fair, because
Yes.
you don't want to, you know,
But
hold some...
it did not contemplate the situation where it is necessary for all commissioners to leave. So if you go to the legalities of it, it would be very difficult for you to initiate that process. And even if you do, it may probably fail, and it failed last year. That is why, for me, I believe that the best persons to initiate that process is the commissioners themselves. Much the same way the Chief Justice has decided that he's leaving in June. No law compels him to leave, but he has decided that given that if he continues, his tenure will come to an end just with 2 or so months to the elections. So he thought it's best he leaves earlier out of necessity to allow time for his successor to come in and settle. And that is the same principle
All right.
that I think we should apply there.
So your concern is the time and that constitutional crisis potentially. I want to hear from you as far as also the other issues that have been raised around credibility of the institution, because you're saying trying to remove them once has failed. Let's listen to some of the political class we've heard from court time and again saying they should leave office. So we have politicians on IEBC. If my director could play that for us so we can hear just some of the sentiments around this conversation, and we'll continue our conversation here in studio.
It is in their own best interest to pack up and go.
We are going to meet to agree to have IEBC out, because this body is rotten. It can't help the people of Kenya.
If you don't respect institutions, no matter who you put in that institution, even if you bring a major, as long as you don't respect institutions, you will always differ with them.
So on one hand, there is the question of the time limits. Then we hear the politicians, and you've had the Coalition for Reforms and Democracy saying 2017 we shouldn't go there with IEBC as currently is. What for you have you picked to be the issues they have with the current commission?
I think there are two things that we need to deal with. The first one, and Otiende was right in terms of credibility. I think whatever else you say, for you to say you have free and fair elections, the institution that manages that elections is critical for free and fair elections. It's not just about the processes, it's not just about the rules in place, it's about who is in charge of implementing those rules. And having confidence in the electoral management body is quintessential. So in my view, the levels of credibility of the elections is determined by the credibility that we have in the commission. And to the extent that there are challenges about the credibility, is an issue that we should address as a country. Unfortunately, in my view, we are discussing this thing 3 years late. These were things that were concerns outside the 2013 elections. There was a post-election evaluation that was supposed to be conducted as a country. The manner in which that post-election evaluation was done, because of the issues that people were worried about after the 2013 election, ended up circumventing a lot of the conversations. And so the chicken have come home to roost. Before you even come to the commission itself, we had huge challenges about technology. We haven't resolved those issues until now. Just I think last week you saw the CEO of IEBC saying we are going to have to buy some of the equipment because the batteries that we bought essentially at that time we thought were good, but they're not too good enough. If you remember the challenges around technology then, and we are discussing them now a year to election, we have a situation where the levels of credibility in IEBC is less than 40%. That is going to be clouded with, do they go and don't they go? And yet the reality, Sophia, is a year before elections, the debate as to whether they go or not is a painful debate.
Because the question becomes, and I was reading an article that had been penned by Paul Mwangi in 2008, and he was talking about why ejecting ECK at the time, the team from office will set bad precedent for Kenya. And his argument was that political expediency is what was being sought at the time, as opposed to following the law, which is what you're asking. So on one hand, you're appealing to the goodwill of the commissioners to leave office, and credibility, yes, is an issue of concern we've seen, but is it to the extent that there are certain allegations that wrongdoing that these commissioners have done that can be proven, or is it, as some have argued, it's simply because somebody lost and now they feel things should change? How do you reconcile that for people trying to find direction?
It's not a pleasant position to be in. First of all, and the reason for which, for me, I take the route I do, is that any allegation in terms of wrongdoing is a real process. Let me assure you that even if you were to take that process under Article 250 of removal, it's going to be a long-drawn process. In fact, chances are we might near and even get to elections before the process is over. Forget about wrongdoing and all. Perhaps if we had started whatever processes we wanted earlier, we would have that time. I don't think we do. And so for me, I would rather not go into questions of who did what wrong.
Isn't that what the law requires of us?
Yes, because when the same law requires the Chief Justice to be in place up to next year, June. Should we insist that he stays up to June? Can we appoint the Chief Justice?
The commissioners want to stay
Absolutely.
put.
That's why I'm encouraging them, that there comes a time where the greater public good could actually supersede your own rights. It cannot be argued otherwise. The commissioners are completely entitled to stay put, and they're completely entitled to due process if anybody makes allegations of wrongdoing. My concern that if we go that way, it's going to, instead of solve the process, it's going to create the crisis. Because we are talking of 9 commissioners. We are talking of a process that would have to involve going to Parliament, and if Parliament endorses, then you start a process of a tribunal for each one of them. It's not something we can solve in the next, so many, months. I think that the solution must be one that is inclusive, must be one that leaves even the commissioners happy. They go with their full packs, and it puts the politicians now to come together to a table and say it is all in our collective interest to have credible elections.
But what if what you've suggested could happen does not happen? That means they can still work and finish the election and then be able to leave, because it's
then
just
the
a probability.
Problem is what Dr. Dote is talking about. Elections is not just a question of the process of coming to the elections. You don't want to come to an election when there are many, many questions before the elections question itself. You'd rather solve those. That's why in 2012 and under the Constitution, we tried to solve all the election questions that were, lingering, so that they were out of the way and you just had the elections itself. Right now, there appears to be too many questions from the IEBC, and it's not just IEBC. We still don't have a substantive register of political parties. The judiciary the Supreme Court also has issues. Issues of hate speech are rising. So we are building on many, many issues, which if we go with to elections, then it becomes dangerous.
But Sophia, let me just, in light of what Otiende says, that's why I think mixing the 3 things, I think is a dangerous thing. Because Otiende gave you 3 possible problems on the elections, and yet we want to find an outcome without determining which of those we are solving.
Right.
Currently, people are solving the issues about misconduct, issues about violation of the Constitution, trying to remove them through that process. At the same time, there are concerns about legitimacy. At the same time, there are concerns about transition. I think as a country, with only 15 or 16 months remaining, we need to determine which of those 3 we are focusing on. And I think I agree with Otiende, we should stop this focus on the constitutional violations. Because that's, in my view, 4 years to an election, that's not the greatest challenge people are having. You can deal with people, assuming, for example, let's take the one that is huge, assuming, for example, Chickengate. Chickengate can go on, irrespective of whether one is a commissioner or not. You can still do the investigation. So we should park that and say, by the way, with 15 months, let's not over-focus on removing the commissioners through the process of constitutional violations, because I think there will be different perspectives.
Yeah.
The next one is the one about transition. And on that, I think for me, relying on goodwill of people, relying on the goodwill of the Chief Justice is not a way to run a country. We must realize that this thing of transition is a challenge we are going to face over and over again, and we need to find some time to address how we deal with the transitions around elections. In my view, the one we should focus on for these current commissioners is the one of legitimacy, because that's the one that concerns all of us. That we are in an election where, because of the legitimacy, credibility, other things arise, and we might have an election where, in spite of all the good work you do, people will not be happy with it. How do we deal with that? And that requires an inclusive discussion.
So with all the pressure that's on IEBC and has been for the last couple of months, this is what the chairman and one of the commissioners have had to say about all of this.
Every party, it seems that they are taking turns to beat us. When one gets tired, the other one takes over.
We can go home and other commissioners can come in, other Kenyans can come in. So tuko tayari kwenda nyumbani kama ni kwenda nyumbani.
So that goodwill doesn't come across. Even when I sat down with the chairman, I asked him, would you then step aside, as has been, advised by many, proposed? They have not indicated, any of the commissioners, that they're going to say, you know what, okay, let's go. So they're staying put. So goodwill appears to, at this point, have failed. And isn't it so that the Constitution placed that threshold so high up in removing these commissioners? Because they do not want abuse to then, come into play. Because many will then come, as the commissioner is saying, sometimes this poll will not be happy with you, this other set will not be happy with you. So what are we saying as we go to 2017? That there are issues that can't be resolved?
First of all, let's just take one step. In that clip, I saw the second commissioner saying they are ready to go home.
When they are found culpable.
And for me, as I understand this conversation, it is not that the IEBC commissioners have said we will not go home if we are offered. The problem is everybody assumes there's another person who will initiate this discussion. Everybody, IEBC assumes this should be initiated perhaps in parliament or by the political parties. The political parties are unable to initiate that discussion. Civil society are writing about it. In my view, the persons to initiate this discussion are the commissioners themselves. Now, the reason why I come back to them, and this is where we don't agree with Dr. Dote, is that for all the legitimacy issues, where do you anchor it, the discussion in terms of whether they should continue or not? Ultimately, either you go through the removal process or you must discuss with them. Now, for me, the easiest way is to discuss with them, because once you've discussed, and if commissioners agree to go home voluntarily with their full packs, the question of was there legitimacy or not is now killed. Because the question will now be, how do we agree on a commission through the political process that no one will complain about? The question of illegalities, if there were any, can continue, as Dr. Dote says. But once they agree, then all these other questions are swept aside. All
right. So, Dote, if they don't agree, we have a problem that cannot be solved going into 2017.
I actually don't think so. In fact, for me, it should not be them to agree.
Yeah.
Because who does not have credibility in them? It is not them who do not have credibility themselves. It is Kenyans who don't have credibility in them, at least according to the opinion surveys. I think Kenyans must have the conversation and say, we are having our elections in 2017. In these elections, we don't have credibility in IEBC. How do we then deal with it and reach the solutions? Once you reach the solution, you can then have the conversation with IEBC. But to expect IEBC to have that conversation is the same thing as expecting your maid in the house to then say, I see my boss has no credibility in me. Maybe it is time for me to leave. I think it's a conversation that the owners of the house are refusing to have, and they need to have that.
And with this, I'm reminded in 2008, EU coming into play, talking about soft landing and financial incentives. Is that a route you would see coming in and perhaps encouraging some of these commissioners to say, okay, if there's a conversation that has been begun, and we saw even international organizations coming in to say, you really need to go?
I truly believe that is the way to go, and that is why in our advisory we were talking about stepping aside honorably with the full packs. Now, the alternative that Dr. Dote talks about, the fear is this: there will be no alternative, however much you agree, without then going to the Constitution. The only other alternative to that long-drawn process is to go and amend Article 250 in terms of removal. Now, are we prepared to do that? I think to go that way, we might in fact end up with a bigger stalemate. Starting a process of amending that constitution right now, because you will not have an avenue that is against the constitution. Even if the political parties agree, they must still come and see how to fit that within the constitution. Now, I think it's going to be very difficult. The easiest route for me, I still maintain, is to appeal to the goodwill of the commissioners and with all the persuasion. You see, what the commissioners must understand is that election is not an internal thing to IEBC. It is for Kenyans. Now, whether Kenyans and with those opinion polls, whether they are right in their perception or not is not the important thing. The important thing is the numbers. Now, if those numbers point to a problem, then that problem must be addressed. We all can't pretend that there's no problem, because then we'll be walking to a crisis knowingly.
So, Dr. Odote, what do you see as the issues? Let's outline them with this IBC before we also just look back, because for ECK there had to be that scrapping, deleting of a section in the Constitution to allow for changes to be made. So, you talked about technology, that things did not largely work out as they should have in 2013. There's a question of the register. And many questions, especially with the Okoa Kenya referendum drive, we saw some of those issues raised. What else do you see as issues IBC needs to come out clearly on?
I think even before you go to technology and the register, the biggest elephant in the room for IEBC is largely stakeholder engagement.
Okay.
Both in the run up to 2013 and after 2013. I think there is a whole feeling in the political class and several other stakeholders that you aren't dealing with us honestly and openly.
But how do you deal with someone who doesn't want you in office? They don't even trust you. They don't want to talk to you.
The question is why? That's the first. You see, unfortunately, and that's why for me, you see me disagreeing with Otiende, that a lot of the challenges that IEBC has is to start with a historical challenge. That because in 2013 there are things that went wrong, and we think they went wrong because you didn't deal with them honestly and you didn't deal with them transparently. We don't trust you to be able to give us an honest answer. And you see, that's a huge issue. So when you start with the register, because of the concerns people had with the register in 2013, IEBC has done a lot of work in the register after 2013. But who knows what work they have done? Who cares about the work they have done? People just say, no, you will do this work. When it comes to 2017, our names will not be on the register, even if we come to inspect. And you see, that's a huge challenge, that even with the benefit of a lot of technical work that you do, you won't deal with that perception challenge.
Wow. So, technology, register, voter registration, we saw that carried out, and there were issues that were raised around that. Transmission of results as well are other issues. But when we look at what perhaps, solved the issue of having an ECK that was largely seen to be having membership or being appointed by the presidency, going forward, and we'll get back to this later, and as far as the composition of an IEBC, because will we keep having cycles where people come, okay, now we're not happy, we need to get these ones out of office? Because there's already a law that now we are seeing is a problem, because trying to go through what the Constitution says will not work in the time that we have. So what do we see then happening? Do we have stakeholders coming and deciding who the people will be? How should the IEBC be composed, do you think? And the confidence of most, if not all.
I know that, and Dr. Dote will have a lot to say on this, I think. I know there's been a lot of proposals in terms of how to do this. I know there have been proposals in terms of the political parties nominating the commissioners. There have been proposals in terms of just making sure that there's participation within and without parliament. As you know, what brokered some of the issues historically in 1997 and thereafter was the important aspect of the various political players having a collective say. Now, for me, it is not the exact process that is important. What is important is that whatever process is adopted, and obviously whatever process it is, cannot exclude politicians and political parties because they're the key players. Whatever process it is one that must not end up with a situation where a significant number of people think that this is already a done deal. It is very dangerous for this country that is always divided along certain, all sorts of lines. It is very important that we have a process that as we are going, at least as we are going, everybody says we are okay.
So
whether they say that after is a different matter.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because we saw that in 2011, the team that had been set up, and then to the Grand Coalition, people felt that Raila Odinga, then Prime Minister, was putting together a team that would be friendly to him. So in terms of elections, there's so much suspicion, which takes us back to that important conversation of then how should it work?
If you look at the current commission and look at how they were appointed, the complaints people are having about them, it's not even about the appointment process. Because the current commission was appointed through a selection panel, where the Prime Minister, then now the current leader of opposition, nominated 2 people. The President, then that's President Kibaki, nominated 2 people. There weren't complaints about their process because it was done on interviews, there was public participation. But as soon as the elections happened, there were complaints around it. That's why for me...
So process is not an issue from where you stand?
process isn't even the big issue. I think we need to sort the process, and the thing to keep in mind is the process must be transparent, there must be public participation, and essentially since this is a political process, you shouldn't have a situation where any political players feels that it is tilted to the side of the opponent. I think for me that's the critical thing. But the more important thing is, even if you look at the appointment process, you see now we are worrying about whether these ones go home or not. You know, whether they go home or not, we will have a new commission in 2017 November. Look at the law. We are currently amending legislations for elections. Which ones are we amending? The Political Parties Act and the Elections Act. There is no bill before the National Assembly for amending the IEBC Act. Yet, the current legislation for the appointment will not deliver a commission that we will all be happy with. The current IEBC Act, the schedule for appointment, A still refers to a prime minister. B says that after the first elections, the 4 people who are to be nominated will be nominated by the president. Can you imagine a situation where the 7 people to appoint, 4 of them are nominated by the president? There will be crisis. Thirdly, that appointment will happen just 2 months when you have a new parliament. So we are still appointing PSS. So the transition process will go. So this is even the time to discuss about whether these people are going home now or not. What is the process for appointing new commissioners? That's why I disagree with Otiende, that I think this is a conversation that Kenyans need to have, because the commissioners that are there, A, it is not their business to determine whether they go home or not, except out of goodwill. But B, if they don't go, by the time we appoint the new ones, they will be away anyway from that conversation.
Wow. So does that make you have a different perspective,
No.
change of heart? Because one of the issues then you even have with the new commission is lack of institutional memory. You're going to a big election. You have 6 elections in essence in one day. There are multiple issues and what he's talking about as well.
It doesn't change anything. And interestingly, I actually agree with Dr. Deto on that further analysis. I actually think that even as we are discussing, the question of legitimacy and all, we must still discuss the question of process of how to end up with a body that, that we believe is okay. You see, and the process of selection of virtually all the commissions, including ourselves, was the same. Indeed, we were sworn in the same day with the IEBC commissioners, having followed the same process. So it's not an indictment of the individuals, for me, within the commission, if there are issues of saying the commission needs to address this matter and the questions of legitimacy. And I think that some of the issues Dr. Dot is talking about are issues that there are logical consequences to having agreed that let's have this discussion, let us persuade the commissioners, which is the easiest way out, then let us now agree on how to reconstitute, including moving forward. And how to build
because
confidence.
what I'm hearing you say is that in terms of moving forward, if they left today, we are not clear, or rather the law is still one that's going to cause us problems because of the nature of our politics as we stand. So credibility then will sink further, because then if the president is going to come and say, all right, 1, 2, 3, 4.
So you know what happens usually with having honest conversations around these matters is that if you have honest conversations on the need to have a legitimate body that is all-inclusive, you can have that conversation and then bring it within the law. The law right now gives authority to make nominations and the panels and all. But if the political players had this conversation, even pending amending the law and all, as we did in 1997, despite the fact and the powers of the president, there's a process that brings people together, and then you agree that this is the team outside. By the time that team is brought to parliament, there have been, consensus and discussions across political parties. You will still end up having a body, even if you don't amend the constitution for now. But that does not take away the need to amend the law moving forward, so that it is quite smooth.
You see the one thing Otiende said?
Yeah.
If there was conversation outside the law, and he says by who? The political players.
Absolutely.
Who are heavily vested.
And you see, the genesis of why even the commissioners will be reluctant is a lot of the time the decision as to whether they leave or not takes us back to 2013. Because that's what at the perception of everybody's mind. And I think that's why, for me, the honest conversation needs to take place amongst the political class involving the rest of the citizens, so that we determine, and that will give us a much broader discussion. So the discussion about whether do they leave or not, if they were to leave, how do we appoint? And once you reach that conversation, then in terms of implementing, you start then having the legal conversations, you start then having the transitional conversation with the IEBC, but there is at least some levels of momentum that the country has generated.
That is true. There's only one problem. We have been talking about having that conversation for how long? We've still not had it.
Not talking.
So, for me, it is to create the crisis. If the commissioners decide we are going, then instantly, the moment is created to have that conversation.
So
If
you
they
maintain
don't, it
goodwill
keeps-
is what will
Absolutely.
save us, save the day. We talked about appointment and how these commissioners come into office. Let's listen to once ECK, that's the Electoral Commission of Kenya Chair, Mr. Chesoni, and what he had to say in as far as tenure of the commissioners is concerned.
If you look at the compendium of electoral commissions in the world, the majority of them are appointed by the head of state. Most people in this country, both newspapers and politicians, told us, we want a commission, an electoral commission like the Indian one. The Electoral Commission of India is one commissioner, chief commissioner, one person, and he's the one who recommends the other commissioners to be appointed. And he's appointed by the President of India. Now, he's not the only one. Most of the electoral commissions are appointed by the head of state. The other alternative is that appointments of members should come as a result of names being submitted by political parties. Are not those players? They are players.
We've heard from a man who once served at the helm of then ECK. What do you think about that? Is that a way we could go? He thinks president appointing not an issue, or have things changed since?
We are smiling because Commissioner Chesoni speaks with one mouth and removes with the other. That's one instance. But the second instance, Commissioner Chesoni may be speaking about Kenya in 1988,
Yes.
not Kenya in 2016. I think if you look at the fundamentals of our constitution, the fundamentals of the constitution was essentially because we didn't want a presidency that was overbearing. Secondly, he says political parties are players. The president is a player in the elections. So if the issue about the political parties that are players can't appoint, is the same challenge you'll have about political parties. I think at the end of the day, the only way you can have an appointment that makes sense is one that is inclusive and one that everybody believes that what we're appointing is not favoring one side. So I would disagree with Commissioner Chesoni's
So like the IPPG 97 that brought all of this, you come with your 10, I bring my 10. Well, now we have lesser numbers, but that would work in essence, you say.
Well,
It sounds easy.
Sounds easy, but not that easy. Let's talk about independence, because constitutional commissions, that is what is required. You know, that you should be able to work without biases. But largely, we've seen, even with the issue of the Okoa Kenya signatures, 2 days before them coming out to talk about the fake signatures or not them being sufficient, we had Jubilee members coming out to say, you know, in fact, this and this will not happen. So there have been questions of, are they independent? Are they partial? There was the question of the server in 2013, you know, being in the same place as that of TNA. So there have been allegations around independence. Do you think IEBC has done this unto itself? Could it have done better to portray, to be perceived as independent from where you sit?
Well, to be fair, we live in a country where we must be acutely aware that questions of independence will always arise. That is why in the Constitution, when we put the process of appointment, we make it open, and then we also say that when the composition of the commissioners must reflect the ethnic diversity and regional diversity of this country, so that through that mix, the question of independence may not be so acute. But in fairness, and I think Dr. Dote said this, I think the current composition of IEBC was never an issue in terms of independence at appointment. I think some of the issues that have arisen subsequently. Okay. And some of them, as the chair, and the chair is my friend, has also defended himself in terms of there are things that people do in your name, you know, and sometimes it's questions of perception. But the problem is, for me, issues of legitimacy and issues of trust, sometimes there's very little you can do when people choose to lose trust in you. I mean, it's like love, and sometimes you must let it just go, you know. And so as a collectivity, it's not a question of going, and sometimes you can, and trying to identify from 1 to number 100, what are the issues that we have done to lose trust. It is that if the surveys demonstrate consistently that a great majority do not have trust, then let them appoint through their representatives those in whom they have the trust, and you sit back. Sometimes, actually, then they discover that they wish they still had you. But you must give them that space, And that, for me, that's how I see it.
Yeah. Please clarify for us, because I was seeing a few tweets and people asking, is Dr. Odote talking about, that being impossible in as far as getting people in place in the event this commission was let go, in the event they left office? One Jeff here is asking, so does it mean we do not have even law to put together another commission? So break it down for us. If today the Goodwill decided, okay, we're done, we're tired of all this, we're leaving, what would it take to form another
If
commission?
today they said that we are going home, the law currently says, if you read with the interpretation, 4 people will be nominated by the President. President Uhuru Kenyatta will nominate 4 people, 2 men, 2 women. 1 person will be nominated by somebody called the Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission Board. That board does not exist. It was in the previous law where you had Professor Lumumba, and you then had a chair, Nasir Abdullahi at some point, and then Okongo Mugeni. So that's the board that was supposed to nominate somebody. We don't have that current board, so we'd have to grapple around it. The next person would be nominated by the Association of Professional Societies of East Africa, APSEA. And the 7th person would be nominated by the Judicial Service Commission. I can guarantee you, as soon as that happens, there'll be huge outcry, if nothing happens in the law, from the opposition, saying, look, we are having a situation where 4 of the people being nominated, 4 of the people nominating have been appointed directly by the President. If you apply strict
So
law.
does the opposition then not know this? Do they
No,
not
but-
know they're calling for something that then would even present a worse scenario?
No, let's clarify this. 2 things, and while what Dr. Deti says is true, there are other laws which are similarly worded, and what they have done is to interpret them with variations. Now there's no prime minister and stuff like that. But the 7 he's talking about are not the nominees. These are the ones who are supposed to make the panel that interviews. The process as it was when the commissioners are being appointed, and as it would be even now, is that of course there would be advertisement, in fact, in inviting people to apply.
Right.
Then there would be some firm to shortlist at some level. Then this firm would bring names to this panel. This panel would interview and recommend further names now to the parliamentary committee, which again would interview and reduce the names maybe to 15 or something. And then they'll discuss, and then it makes its way to the presidency and all. So it is not good, but it's not as grim. However, the point he makes, which I agree with and which I keep making, is that to assume that once the commissioners go home, then without conversation, we will end up with a body that we are thinking about is not true. We must still have that conversation. And it's in the context of that conversation that all these things must be discussed. That now that there's no prime minister, then how do you deal with that? How do you balance out so that even the panel that deals with it can be seen to be independent?
Right.
How do you actually go? Do you go that way, or do you go the other way that has been suggested, where politicians actually forward the names? So those are the conversations we'd have around there once we sit down. Our problem is that we are just assuming there's no problem.
So at least the one thing we
Yes.
agree with Otiende
Yes.
is whether it is out of goodwill or out of the conversation, that conversation must take place.
Must be had.
And I think the important thing
That's
is
for
to stress
sure.
the point that whichever way you go, we can't run away from having
And it's
a
the
conversation.
politicians to have that conversation.
At least the one person I know who is not the principal driver of that conversation is IEBC. That conversation requires everybody else except
But
IEBC,
IEBC.
because it is them that we are reconstituting. It is them who we are appointing, either because they have gone home out of their goodwill, or they have gone home because their time has ended. That conversation we are running away from, and we need to have it.
That conversation would include politicians, civil society, constitutional commissions and independent officers, and even those who are concerned. I mean, we've always been supported, including by the international, the UNDP and others. All the conversations we've had in this country usually include them. It should be an all-inclusive conversation, because we must do what is important and good for this country.
Yeah, and
Yes.
we'll end up with talking about if that conversation doesn't happen, because we are hoping it would happen. But we've had the chairman and the commission of the IEBC time and again talk about staggering the elections. That 6 elections in one day is heavy for the commission. It's the first time that was done in 2013. It was one of the reasons that was given as to why there was so much confusion and breakdown of technology. Do you agree with that kind of a proposal?
I don't agree. And the reason why I don't agree is because we only had one election in 2013. We only that was the first election under the constitution. 6 in one day, but the first. Secondly, for that election, we had less than 2 years for preparations. This commission was appointed in 2011. We then had elections in 2013. So we need a full electoral cycle. Secondly, changing the 6 elections means that we are going to have to amend the constitution. But thirdly, remember the proposal that the chair is making was actually part of the proposals that Otiende and group dealt with at the committee of experts. At some point, there was a suggestion to stagger those elections. One was to be in August, if I'm not wrong, another one was to be in December. We then decided in our wisdom as Kenyans to put them together for costs and for other conveniences. I think let us deal with the other fundamentals of the elections. If out of 2017 and 2022, having sorted these other things we think is not workable, then let's be able to go to staggered. But I think for now, it's too early to make that proposal.
Your thoughts?
I don't agree with the chair at all. The problems we had in 2013 had nothing to do with the numbers. In fact, the evidence is that voting ended quite early, despite the 6 elections, especially with the aid of the electronic identification systems and all those things. We should actually take almost half the time we were taking previously when everything was manual. So the problem is not the numbers. Once you are there and you are given 6, the idea of previously we were putting in 3 boxes, now we are putting in 6. It does not take that much time. But more importantly, we examined this in detail. If you want proper chaos and disputes over elections, try to stagger them in this country. Because chances are you'll start with the presidential elections. Once you have declared a winner at a presidential level, I assure you all these other stages are going to be chaotic. So for us, we strategically said that we must have all those elections once. And that way, even the question of interference is minimal. Because everybody is busy focusing from the MCA to the president. And the expectation is that there should not be heavy tilting and interference with the election. So I don't agree.
So you had ECK, IEBC, here is IEBC. Have we learned any lessons, do you think, in as far as elections management in Kenya is concerned? And also drawing from our neighbors and around the world, because IEBC commissioners observe elections around the world.
I don't want to speak for them. And I also don't want to talk about our neighbors. Let me talk around the world, because if we speak about our neighbors, we might be forced to comment, for example, about the Ugandan elections recently. I am not sure we want to learn lessons from it. But if you look at, take for example, the elections taking place in the US, I think they are even much more contested than ours. Do you hear conversations about the Electoral Commission? You don't hear, and that's something for us to learn. I think the thing that we need to appreciate as a country is we need to ensure that we build institutions that are strong and institutions that are be able to stand the test of time. That challenge, unfortunately, we discuss it as either or. That is either a challenge for the country by saying don't disband, or it's either a challenge for the commission in terms of being credible and communicating. I think it is both ways.
So lessons from other commissions in the past? ECK, IEC, the issues around, because ECK was thrown out. IEC, a few members came into IEBC, but still.
I think if you talk about ECK, there are 2 lessons you learn. The 2 lessons you learn is sometimes disbanding is not the only solution. That's one thing you learn. But the second thing that you learn from ECK is that if you don't address problems, then you have bigger problems. Because remember in ECK, we threw them out after the 2007 elections, where there was violence. So we need to learn both lessons in terms of we must do everything possible to ensure that elections that we hold are fair, are free, and are peaceful. Secondly, we need to also learn the fact that sometimes we are forced to make painful decisions, but if you just think that that just getting rid of people is a solution on its own, on its own it's not a solution. That's why both Otiende and myself were saying that a national conversation is critical, so that we identify the key challenges and address all of them comprehensively as a country.
Your thoughts?
I think we've learned a lot of lessons, but we still have more to learn. We've certainly moved quite far from where we were. Previously, you could not even challenge the election of the president. If you remember, even serving that petition you could not do. Now we can. Previously, we would get to the next elections before electoral disputes are determined. Now we determine most of them within 6 months. Previously, even the question of discussing appointment of commissioners by through negotiation and discussion was not there. As Chesoni was saying, it's by the president. Now it's
President,
different.
yeah.
But I still think there are a lot of key lessons we need to learn. And what we need to do is be honest about this. This is not about vilification. This is about getting to do what is right for the future of this country so that we can actually perfect our electoral process. And personally, I think that we do not converse enough about the problems we have in this country, including elections. We would rather, put those things and lock them somewhere and assume it's not a problem. Because if we start talking about them, then it will go to the party, it will go to the tribe, it will go to other things. We must be honest and confront our problems, because problems don't go away.
Don't go away. Finally, as we wrap up, we have 2 minutes to go. The question, that we brought in, because we're talking about if these conversations don't happen, if they don't leave office as you proposed, we have 15 months to go to the next election. Many are saying this country is going to burn even worse than we saw happen in 2007, 2008. IEBC plus the judiciary and the Supreme Court involved in conflict resolution. Tie in for me what then to expect going forward. In the event these things don't happen, you have the judiciary itself having its own issues, IEBC with a dented credibility. What are we saying for Kenya? What are we telling the people at home? Beginning with you.
Starting with myself, I think for me the issue about this conversation not happening, it's not an option. This conversation must happen. And Sophia, I think to expect that conversation to only happen amongst the political class and to only happen amongst IEBC is lying to ourselves. We are sitting here having the conversation. So why are you saying this conversation, if it doesn't happen? It must happen. The thing we must do is increase the voices, so that, because when we don't have the conversations honestly and we don't discuss those problems, they will face not the commissioners, they will face not the judiciary, they will face us as Kenyans. So as Kenyans, we need to have the conversation and put the pressure on the other entities so that they are part of that conversation.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Well, for me, it's about identifying some of the warning signs that historically and given the situation we are in, might portend danger for us. And for me, it is to identify them and seal them. And one of them, the IEBC is only one of them. There are still other electoral issues. The Supreme Court is another that we must really have that conversation. The idea of a substantive holder of the registrar of political parties is another, because a lot of political parties need to be held accountable in so many ways. And then, of course, there's the growing matter of hate speech. The fact that not a single person, as far as I know, has gone to jail since the last election on account of hate speech has tended to increase the threshold of those who think they can say anything because they won't go to court. And that is something else we must deal with. And so we need to identify these warning signs and seal them, because there's no point in waiting until it blows over. It is our job to identify them and deal with them, so that we go into the elections with confidence and not with the kind of fears we've had in the past.
All right. We thank you both for your views tonight. Ombudsman Dr. Otiende Amolo, as well as Senior Lecturer at the University of Nairobi, Dr. Collins Odote, with us tonight. I also just want to read a few of your comments tonight. A lot of you tweeted in, many of you. Problem with election management, Mwalimu Cheriot says, is tribalism. Whoever loses doesn't trust IEBC. Stephen Kiakau, you think IEBC should be disbanded with immediate effect. Maurice Oduor, the IEBC has to go. It has lost the confidence of Kenyans. Flora Mang, that Babu is a flock of feather with Muga. Okay, he's talking about a whole different story. Babu, we know. All right, Hanshi, you're saying we only say an institution ought to be independent but in bed with the ruling coalition. The last word. Thank you for your views. George Morara, thank you for watching and tweeting in. The last I checked, confidence in the IEBC stood at 16%. Truly worrying figure as we head into the 2017 election. And many more of your thoughts. We thank you so much for watching and participating in a discussion tonight. Now, it is paramount for us to underscore in the last, as we head to the general election next year, that within the parameters of the law, whatever issues there are in the political clamor, as we head to the general election as a nation next year, the environment must be one that fosters peace and unity and not animosity. That's the last word. Thanks for watching. Good night.